Captain Lee Dong-yun stood on the bridge of the research vessel Harmony's Edge and watched the stars drift past the viewing screen like distant diamonds scattered across black silk. The ship moved through space at a comfortable pace, while its sensors swept the empty regions beyond the known galaxy looking for new worlds and new forms of life that might one day join the Great Galactic Council. The Council had been at peace for 300 years now, and Dong-yun often wondered if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Peace meant no wars and no death, but it also meant that most species had grown soft and comfortable. The humans were still new to the Council, having joined only 50 years ago, and they were still trying to prove themselves worthy of membership among the great civilizations of the galaxy. Dr. Park Minji walked onto the bridge carrying a tablet filled with data from their latest survey. She was the ship's xenobiologist, and one of the smartest people Dong-yun had ever met. Her job was to study alien life forms and figure out how to make first contact without causing panic or war. She had written 3 books on peaceful contact protocols, and the Council considered her an expert on the subject. Lieutenant Kim Hyun-woo sat at the navigation station plotting their course through the Outer Rim territories. These were the wild spaces beyond Council control where anything might be hiding. He was young and eager to prove that humans could be just as brave and capable as the older species, like the mighty Corvan warriors or the psychic Athene, who could read minds across vast distances. The Harmony's Edge was not a warship, but a science vessel designed for exploration and research. It carried no weapons, except for basic defensive shields and a small security team. The humans had built it according to Council specifications, which meant it was meant to run from trouble, not fight it. This suited the Council just fine, because they believed that violence was something civilized species should avoid at all costs. Dong-yun had served in the old Earth Defense Force before joining the Council fleet, and sometimes he missed the weight of real weapons and the comfort of knowing his ship could defend itself. But those days were over now. Humans were supposed to be peaceful explorers and diplomats, not warriors. The Council had made that very clear when they accepted humanity's membership. Minji approached his command chair and showed him the readings. On her tablet, Captain. We are picking up some strange energy signatures about 2 light years ahead of us. They do not match anything in our databases. Hyun-woo turned from his station and added, Sir, the patterns are unlike anything we have seen before. They appear to be moving in formation and heading toward Council. Space Dong-yun studied the data and frowned. The energy readings were massive, far larger than any known starship or space station. They pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost alive, but no known species used biotechnology on this scale. What are your thoughts? Dr. Park Minji scrolled through more data on her tablet. The energy signatures are definitely artificial, but they use principles of physics that should not be possible. According to our models, they appear to be tearing holes in space itself. Captain, I think we should report this to the Council immediately. Hyun-woo stood up from his station. Sir, if these things are heading toward Council space, we might be looking at some kind of invasion force. Should we not try to get closer and gather more intelligence? Dong-yun considered the options. His ship was fast and had excellent sensors, but it was not built for combat. If these unknown vessels were hostile, the Harmony's Edge would be helpless against them. On the other hand, the Council needed to know what was coming, and his crew were the only ones in position to gather information. Dr. Park, I want you to run a full analysis on those energy patterns. See if you can figure out what kind of technology could produce readings like that. Lieutenant Kim, plot a course that will keep us at maximum sensor range but allow us to track their movement. I want to know exactly where they are going and how fast they are getting there. The next few hours passed in tense silence as the crew worked to understand what they were seeing. The energy signatures continued to move toward Council space at a speed that defied explanation. They seemed to appear and disappear, as if they were jumping between dimensions rather than traveling through normal space. Minji worked frantically at her station, running the energy patterns through every database and theoretical model she could access. The results made no sense according to everything the Council knew about physics. But as the hours passed, a terrible possibility began to emerge. Captain, she said finally, her voice tight with worry, I have been comparing these readings to some theoretical research that was banned by the Council over a century ago. The patterns match predictions for dimensional breach technology. Dong-yun felt his blood run cold. Dimensional breach technology was something the Council had forbidden all member species from researching. The theory suggested that it might be possible to tear holes between parallel universes, but the risks were considered too great. Even attempting such research was grounds for expulsion from the Council. Lieutenant opened a priority channel to Council Central. Command: tell them we have detected unknown vessels using prohibited technology and that they appear to be heading for inhabited systems. Hyunwoo's fingers flew over his controls. Sir, I am trying, but something is interfering with our communications. The interference seems to be coming from the same direction as those energy signatures. Minji looked up from her tablet with fear in her eyes. Captain, if these things are using dimensional breach technology, then they are not from our universe. They could be from anywhere or anywhen. The Council banned this research because they were afraid of what might come through if someone tore a hole between realities. Dong-yun stood up and walked to the viewing screen where he could see the distant stars. The peaceful galaxy he had known for the past 50 years suddenly felt very fragile. Humans had joined the Council because they wanted to be part of something greater than themselves. They had put aside their old ways of war and conflict to embrace the Council's vision of peace and cooperation. But now something was coming through the dark between worlds, and Dong-yun had a feeling that peace might not be enough to stop it. He thought about Earth and its 4 billion people living there quiet, lives under Council protection. He thought about all the other worlds in Council space filled with beings who had never known real war or faced an enemy that wanted to destroy everything they held dear. Dr. Park. How long before those signatures reach the first Council world? She checked her calculations. About 18 hours, sir, assuming they maintain their current speed. 18 hours to warn the Council, 18 hours for the greatest military minds in the galaxy to figure out how to stop an enemy. They did not understand using technology that should not exist. Dong-yun had served long enough to know that 18 hours was not nearly enough time. Lieutenant, try the emergency channels. Try everything we have got. The Council needs to know what is coming. Even if we can only get a basic warning through it, might save lives. As Hyunwoo worked desperately to break through the interference, Dong-yun found himself thinking about the old stories from Earth's history. Stories about ordinary people who faced impossible odds and somehow found the strength to fight back against overwhelming enemies. He had always thought those stories were just myths, designed to make humans feel better about their violent past. But now, as he watched unknown forces move through space toward everything he cared about, Dong-yun began to wonder if those old stories might be more important than anyone had realized. The Council believed that civilization meant putting aside the old ways of war and conflict. But what happened when civilization faced something that did not care about peace or diplomacy? The energy signatures pulsed brighter on the sensors, and Dong-yun felt something cold settle in his stomach. Whatever was coming through the dark between worlds, it was not interested in joining the Galactic Council. It was not looking for peace or cooperation. It was something else entirely, and Dong-yun suspected that very soon the galaxy was going to remember why some species had evolved to be very good at fighting wars. The first world to die was Corvin Prime, home to 12 billion of the galaxy's finest warriors. The Corvin had never lost a battle in their 3,000-year history, and their military academies were considered the best in Council space. When the dimensional rifts opened above their cities, the Corvin fleet responded with their usual confidence and precision. Admiral Song Ji-ho watched the battle from his flagship 2 systems away and could not believe what his sensors were showing. Corvin heavy cruisers were being torn apart by ships that looked like they had been grown rather than built. These vessels pulsed with organic movement and seemed to feed on the energy weapons fired at them. The more the Corvin fought back, the stronger their enemies became. The ships that emerged from the dimensional tiers were nightmares made real. They moved through space like living things with hulls that rippled and writhed as if they were breathing. Their weapons were not energy beams or projectiles, but streams of pure terror that somehow reached through shields and armor to attack the minds of their targets. Song watched in horror as the proud Corvin warriors began screaming over their communication channels. Their ships stopped firing and started fleeing as crews that had never known fear suddenly found themselves paralyzed by visions of things that should not exist. The enemy vessels followed them like predators chasing wounded prey, and the screams grew louder until they suddenly stopped. Corvin Prime went silent in less than 4 hours. The second world to fall was Ethani Central, where the galaxy's most powerful psychics lived in crystal cities that floated above purple seas. The Ethani had always been able to sense danger before it arrived, and their mental networks could coordinate defenses across entire star systems. But when the dimensional rifts opened above their world, something went wrong with their abilities. The enemy broadcast thoughts and images that no sane mind could process. The Ethani psychic network collapsed under the weight of alien madness as thousands of telepaths tried to understand minds that operated according to rules that violated everything they knew about consciousness. The crystal cities fell from the sky as their inhabitants clutched their heads and screamed. Song tried to coordinate a defense, but his fleet was scattered across dozens of systems, and the enemy seemed to know exactly where to strike next. They ignored military targets and went straight for population centers as if they were more interested in causing terror than winning battles. Each attack followed the same pattern. Dimensional rifts would open above a world, and nightmare ships would pour through to attack civilian areas. The third world to die was Zephyrian Hub, where the galaxy's energy beings lived in cities made of pure light. The Zephyrians could manipulate matter and energy with their thoughts, and their defensive shields were considered impenetrable. But the enemy ships seemed to drain energy rather than being stopped by it. The beautiful light cities flickered and went dark as the Zephyrians found their life force being sucked away to power. The invaders' weapons, Song, realized that the enemy was not trying to conquer territory. They were feeding on the suffering they caused. Each destroyed world made them stronger, and each act of terror gave them more power. It was a kind of warfare that no council species had ever imagined because it violated every principle of civilized conflict. On the Council's capital world, Ambassador Yoon So-young stood in the Great Assembly Hall and watched as representatives from dozens of species argued about what to do. The Corvin demanded immediate military action, but their fleets were in chaos after losing their homeworld. The Ethani could barely speak because their psychic networks were still damaged. The Zephyrians flickered weakly as they tried to recover from having their energy drained. The enemy had sent a message to the Council through every communication channel simultaneously. It was not words, but pure sensation, the feeling of being hunted by something vast and hungry that saw all living things as food. The message carried images of burning worlds and screaming populations, along with the promise that every Council species would eventually feed the hunger of the Vorthak Collective. General Choi Woo-jin sat quietly in the human section of the assembly and listened to the other species panic. The aliens talked about evacuating to the galactic core or surrendering to minimize casualties. They discussed diplomatic solutions and ways to negotiate with an enemy that had made it clear they were not interested in anything except causing suffering. So-young noticed that the humans were not participating in the debate. They sat in their section and watched the other species with expressions she could not read. The humans had always been quiet in council meetings, preferring to listen rather than speak. But this silence felt different. It felt dangerous. The Vorthak leader called itself the Devourer Prime, and it appeared on every screen in the assembly hall without warning. It was a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that hurt to look at directly. Its voice was the sound of worlds dying and civilizations screaming as they were consumed. The creature spoke of feeding on fear and growing stronger from despair. It promised that the Council, worlds would burn slowly so that every moment of terror could be savored. When the transmission ended, the assembly hall was silent, except for the quiet sobbing of species that had never faced an enemy like this. The Corvin warriors who had never retreated were talking about strategic withdrawal. The Ethani, who had always been able to see the future, could only sense darkness ahead. The Zephyrians, who controlled energy itself, felt helpless against an enemy that used their own power against them. That was when General Woo-jin stood up and spoke for the first time since the crisis began. His voice was calm and steady as he asked a simple question. Did that thing just threaten to hurt our families? So-young felt something cold move down her spine as she answered. Yes, it did, Woo-jin smiled. and So-young realized that she had never seen a human truly angry before. The expression on his face was not rage or fear, but something much worse. It was the look of someone who had found something they had been looking for without knowing they were searching. "Good," he said quietly. "It has been too long since we had a proper war." The other species turned to stare at the human delegation with confusion and growing alarm. The humans were supposed to be peaceful explorers and diplomats. They had joined the council to escape their violent past and become part of a civilized galaxy. But something had changed in the humans when they heard the Devourer Prime's threat. Dr. Nam Sung-hwan stood up next to Wu Jin and addressed the assembly. "The human delegation requests permission to return to Earth immediately to coordinate our defensive preparations." The Corvan ambassador asked what defensive preparations the humans could possibly have that would matter against an enemy that had destroyed the galaxy's greatest military power in 4 hours. Wu Jin's smile grew wider as he answered, "We have been at peace for 50 years, Ambassador, but we have not forgotten what we are. When something threatens our families, we remember very quickly." The human delegation filed out of the assembly hall, leaving behind a room full of confused and frightened aliens who had no idea what they had just witnessed. The peaceful humans who had spent 50 years building hospitals and schools and research stations were going home to remember how to build something else. So Young followed them into the corridor and caught Wu Jin by the arm. "General, what are you not telling the council? What do humans have that could possibly stop these creatures?" Wu Jin looked at her with eyes that had gone very cold. "Ambassador, have you ever wondered why humans were so eager to join the council? Why a species that had spent its entire history fighting wars suddenly wanted peace so badly?" She shook her head. Not understanding where he was going with this, "It was not because we had become peaceful," he said. "It was because we had become too good at war. We joined the council because we were afraid of what we might do if we kept fighting each other. But now something else has given us a target, and for the first time in 50 years, every human in the galaxy is going to be working toward the same goal." "What goal?" she whispered. Wu Jin's smile disappeared, and his voice became very quiet. "We are going to show these creatures what happens when you threaten to hurt human families. We are going to remind the galaxy why some species evolved to be very good at killing things. While the other council species retreated to their core worlds and prepared defensive positions, something unprecedented happened in human space. Instead of running away from the Vorthak invasion, humanity did something that made no sense to any other species in the galaxy. They moved toward the enemy fleet. Admiral Kang Daeho emerged from Earth's solar system 3 days after the human delegation left the council assembly, and what followed him defied every assumption the galaxy had made about human capabilities. The fleet that appeared was not the small collection of research vessels and cargo ships that everyone expected. It was an armada of 3,000 warships that had seemingly appeared from nowhere. The vessels themselves were wrong in ways that made alien observers uncomfortable. These were not the peaceful exploration ships that humans had been building for the past 50 years. These were weapons designed by minds that understood war in ways that made other species nervous. The ships were sleek and predatory, with hulls that seemed to absorb light and weapon arrays that covered every surface. Captain Lim Ji-hoon commanded the heavy cruiser, Retribution's Dawn, and as he watched his fleet deploy into attack formation, he felt something he had not experienced in decades: the excitement of going to war against an enemy that deserved everything humans were about to do to them. His crew moved with practiced efficiency as they prepared weapons that the Council had never seen and activated systems that should not have existed. The galaxy learned that humans had never stopped being warriors. They had simply become very good at hiding what they really were. For 50 years, while building hospitals and schools and diplomatic stations, they had also been building something else. A fleet designed to fight wars that the Council hoped would never come, staffed by people who had volunteered to remember what their species had once been. Commander Bae Hyejin stood on the bridge of her destroyer and studied the tactical displays showing Vorthak movements. The enemy ships moved like living things, but they followed patterns that could be predicted and exploited. Her crew had spent years studying every conflict in human history, learning lessons that other species considered too violent to teach. The result was a level of tactical creativity that made alien military advisors nervous. The first engagement came when a Vorthak scouting force encountered the human advance fleet near the ruins of Corvin Prime. The alien ships immediately began broadcasting fear and despair, trying to break the morale of their enemies before the fighting started. It was a tactic that had worked perfectly against every other Council species. The humans responded by laughing. Lieutenant Park Han-yu coordinated the electronic warfare assault that turned the Vorthak's own psychological weapons against them. The fear broadcasts that were supposed to paralyze enemy crews were analyzed and reversed, creating feedback loops that confused the alien bioships. Human engineers had spent decades studying the weapons of war, and they had learned how to make every tool a weapon. The Vorthak ships found themselves facing an enemy that not only felt no fear, but seemed to grow more dangerous, the more frightened they were supposed to be. The human ships moved with coordination that suggested they had been practicing fleet actions for years. Their weapons fire was precise and devastating, and their tactics were both creative and ruthless. Captain Kim Hijin led a boarding party onto a damaged Vorthak bioship to capture prisoners and intelligence. What her team found inside was a living nightmare of corridors that shifted and changed, trying to trap intruders and drive them insane with fear. The ship itself was a weapon designed to break the minds of anyone who entered it. The humans adapted in ways that the Vorthak could not understand. Instead of being driven mad by the shifting environment, Hyejin's team began mapping the changes and predicting the patterns. They treated the hostile alien ship like a puzzle to be solved rather than a horror to be endured. Their calm professionalism in the face of nightmare scenarios confused and frustrated their enemies. Engineer Oh Yoonji worked with captured Vorthak technology and discovered something that changed everything about the war. The alien bioships were not just weapons, they were also factories that could be reprogrammed. Human engineers began modifying captured vessels, turning the enemy's own technology against them in ways the Vorthak had never imagined possible. The psychological warfare that had broken a dozen civilizations proved useless against humans who had evolved to be both predator and prey. Humans understood fear as a tool rather than an overwhelming force, and they knew how to use it against enemies who had become dependent on terror as their primary weapon. Dr. Song Min-hwan studied captured Vorthak specimens and made a discovery that explained why the aliens were so successful against other species. The creatures fed on specific types of brain chemistry that were common to most council races, but humans had evolved differently. Their fear responses were connected to anger and aggression in ways that made them more dangerous when threatened, rather than less effective. Colonel Shin Min-seok commanded the 1st Human Regiment to use captured Vorthak fear enhancers against their creators. The psychological weapons that had broken the Corvin warrior spirit and collapsed the Ethani psychic networks made humans angry in ways that terrified their enemies. The more the Vorthak tried to break human morale, the more creative and vicious the human response became. The tide of war began to shift as human fleets pushed deeper into Vorthak-controlled space. Captain Ryu Hyunsu discovered the location of a primary dimensional anchor that was allowing enemy reinforcements to pour through from their home reality. Instead of trying to destroy the anchor, he made a decision that changed the nature of the conflict entirely. He prepared to follow the enemy home. The other Council species watched from their fortified worlds, as humanity demonstrated capabilities that should not have existed. Their peaceful allies had somehow hidden an entire military infrastructure that was more advanced and more vicious than anything the galaxy had seen. The humans were not just fighting the Vorthak, they were winning. Ambassador Yoon So-young received reports from the front lines that made no sense, according to everything the Council knew about human capabilities. Human ships were adapting Vorthak biotechnology faster than their own creators could modify it. Human troops were boarding enemy vessels and taking control of ships that were designed to drive intruders insane. Human engineers were building weapons that violated several Council treaties about acceptable military technology. When she confronted General Wu Jin about these reports, he smiled in that way that had become familiar and terrifying. "We told you, Ambassador. We have been at peace for 50 years, but we never forgot what we are. The Council wanted us to be explorers and diplomats, so we became explorers and diplomats. But we also remained human." "What does that mean?" she demanded. It means we are very good at learning new things, and we are very good at breaking things that need to be broken. The Vorthak made the mistake of threatening our families. So now they get to discover what humans are like when we stop pretending to be civilized. The galaxy was beginning to understand that they had not been watching humanity's first war. They had been watching humanity's return to war after a 50-year vacation from violence. The peaceful humans who had built hospitals and schools had also been quietly building the tools they would need when peace was no longer an option. Fleet Admiral John Tae-hyung prepared his forces for the assault on the dimensional rift that would take them into Vorthak home space. The enemy had opened a doorway between realities, expecting to bring terror and suffering to a peaceful galaxy. Instead, they had given humans something they had been missing for 50 years, a reason to remember what they were capable of when properly motivated. The Devourer Prime had consumed 17 realities and broken countless civilizations, but it had never encountered anything like humanity's response to its invasion. Most species broke quickly when faced with the psychological warfare that was the Vorthak's greatest weapon. But humans seemed to grow more dangerous, the more they were threatened. Frustrated and intrigued by this unexpected resistance, the Devourer Prime made a decision that would prove to be a terrible mistake. It opened dozens of dimensional rifts simultaneously and poured entire armadas through, bringing with it creatures that existed purely to inflict suffering on other living beings. The new phase of the invasion brought horrors that had never been seen in this reality, entities that fed on hope itself and turned it into despair. Creatures that could reach through space and time to attack the memories of their victims, turning every happy moment into a source of pain. Things that violated the laws of physics just by existing, and made reality itself sick wherever they appeared. Dr. Nam Sung-hwan stood in the war room aboard the human command ship and studied the reports of these new enemies with professional interest. As a xenopsychologist, he understood how alien minds worked, and he had spent years developing countermeasures for psychological warfare that other species considered impossible to defend against. He activated the emergency communication system that connected every human ship and settlement in the galaxy and broadcast a message that would be remembered for generations. They want to play psychological warfare with the species that invented it. The response was immediate and terrifying. Human fleets that had been fighting defensively suddenly went on the attack with a creativity and viciousness that made their previous efforts look restrained. Engineers who had been adapting Vorthak technology began building weapons that the enemy could not understand or counter. Soldiers who had been treating the war as a professional duty began fighting with a personal hatred that confused and frightened their opponents. Engineer Oh Yoonji led teams that did not just reverse engineer alien biotechnology, they improved it in ways that the Vorthak's hive mind could not comprehend. Human innovation had always been driven by individual creativity and competition, while the enemy operated through collective consciousness. When humans began modifying Vorthak weapons, the results were unpredictable and devastating. The captured fear enhancers that had been designed to break enemy morale were rebuilt to create feedback loops that drove Vorthak bioships insane. The dimensional anchors that allowed travel between realities were modified to create weapons that could exile entire enemy fleets to empty universes. The living ships that were supposed to terrify their opponents were reprogrammed to fear humans more than humans feared them. Colonel Shin Min-sok commanded human forces that had learned to fight in environments that should have driven them mad. His troops operated in spaces where gravity changed based on emotion and air that bred nightmares, where time moved differently and the laws of physics were more like suggestions than rules. The Vorthak had expected their home reality advantages to overwhelm any invasion force. Instead, they found humans who treated impossible conditions as interesting problems to be solved. Human soldiers adapted to fighting in gravity, wells that responded to fear by learning to channel their terror into anger. Human pilots flew through space that tried to drive them insane by focusing on the technical challenges of navigation. Captain Han Kyung-soo led strike teams into Vorthak facilities that were designed to break the minds of intruders through pure horror. These were places where suffering had been refined into an art form and where the architecture itself was built from crystallized despair. His teams moved through these nightmare environments with a calm professionalism that confused their enemies. The humans had discovered something that the Vorthak could not understand. Fear was not something that happened to them. It was something they could use. Fear made them more focused, more creative, and more dangerous. The psychological weapons that had conquered dozens of realities were useless against a species that had learned to weaponize their own terror. Dr. Li Jian made a breakthrough in understanding Vorthak biology that changed the entire war. The creatures that fed on suffering were actually dependent on specific emotional frequencies that were common to most sapient species, but humans produced different emotional signatures. Their fear and anger and determination created patterns that the Vorthak could not digest. This discovery led to the development of emotion bombs that could poison entire Vorthak fleets. Human engineers built weapons that broadcast pure human emotion across multiple dimensions, creating zones of psychological toxicity that enemy bioships could not enter. The creatures that fed on suffering found themselves choking on human defiance. General Moon Ji-woon established the first permanent human base in Vorthak-controlled space, on a world where the ground itself was made of crystallized screams. Her forces built fortifications in an environment that was designed to drive invaders insane, and they not only survived, but thrived. The Vorthak's greatest advantage had always been that their enemies eventually broke under the sheer wrongness of fighting in their reality, but humans had a disturbing talent for finding normal in the abnormal and adapting to conditions that should have been impossible. To endure, Admiral Park Seong-wan coordinated the assault on multiple Vorthak strongholds, simultaneously using tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. Human forces did not try to minimize casualties or avoid collateral damage. They fought with the understanding that this was a war for survival where mercy was a luxury they could not afford. The enemy tried to break human morale by showing them visions of their home worlds burning and their families suffering. But humans responded by broadcasting images of what they intended to do to every Vorthak in existence. The psychological warfare that was supposed to terrify them became fuel for their anger. Captain Yu Jisoo discovered that Vorthak bioships could be infected with modified human-computer viruses that treated the living vessels like biological networks. The enemy's greatest strength, their integration of organic and technological systems, became a weakness when humans began treating their ships like computers that could be hacked. The war reached a turning point when human forces captured a Vorthak command vessel intact and discovered the location of the enemy's dimensional fortress. This was the primary anchor point that allowed travel between realities, and the source of the Devourer Prime's power. Instead of trying to destroy the fortress, human command made a decision that terrified even their own forces. They would assault it directly and either capture or destroy the entity that had terrorized multiple realities. The plan required sending human forces through dimensional barriers into a space where the very concept of existence was hostile to life from their reality. But humans had learned something important during their war against the Vorthak. The universe was much stranger and more dangerous than the peaceful council had ever imagined, and humanity's ability to adapt and survive in impossible conditions was their greatest weapon against enemies that relied on fear and despairs. The human fleet prepared for the final assault on the dimensional fortress. Reports came in from across the galaxy. The council species were emerging from their hiding places and watching in amazement as their newest members fought a war that should have been impossible to win. The humans were not just surviving against an enemy that had broken dozens of civilizations. They were winning, and they were doing it with a combination of technical innovation, tactical creativity, and sheer bloody-minded determination that made other species realize they had never really understood what humanity was capable of. The galaxy was about to learn that humans had spent 50 years pretending to be peaceful explorers and diplomats while quietly preparing for the day when they would need to remember what they really were. Fleet Admiral John Tae-hyung led the human armada through the dimensional rift into a reality that should not have been able to support life from their universe. The Vorthak home dimension was a place where suffering was the fundamental force that held matter together, and where despair had replaced gravity as the organizing principle of physics. The enemy had expected any invasion force to be overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of their realm. Instead, they found humans who treated a hell dimension Like just another hostile environment that needed to be conquered, human engineers began building atmospheric processors to make the air breathable. Human geologists studied ground that screamed when stepped on to find stable locations for bases. Human physicists worked out how to operate technology in a reality where the laws of science were more like guidelines. General Moon Jae-woon established the first human beachhead on a world where emotion had physical weight and negative feelings could crush buildings. Her troops adapted to fighting in an environment where fear made you heavier and anger made you faster. They learned to use the hostile conditions as weapons, turning the enemy's reality against them. The Vorthak had built their civilization on the principle that suffering was power and that fear was the ultimate weapon, but humans had evolved on a world where being afraid meant you were more likely to survive and being angry meant you were more likely to win fights. The psychological environment that was supposed to break invaders made humans more effective at War Captain Lee. Soo-jin commanded a fleet action against Vorthak bioships in space where the stars were powered by torment instead of fusion. Her vessels, adapted to operating in an environment where negative emotions provided energy and positive thoughts, could drain power. The human crews learned to channel their hatred of the enemy into fuel for their weapons. Dr. Kim Tae-won made a discovery that explained why the Vorthak had become so dependent on psychological warfare. The creatures were not naturally evil. They were refugees from something even worse. They had fled into this dimension to escape an enemy that had destroyed their original reality, and they had adapted to their new home by becoming parasites that fed on suffering. The revelation changed everything about the war. The Vorthak were not conquerors. They were survivors who had been shaped by their environment into something monstrous. But they were also victims of something that was apparently still out there in the space between realities. Captain Han Kyung-soo led the assault on the Devourer Prime's fortress ship, a living structure the size of a moon that was powered by the agony of captured civilizations. As his boarding parties fought through corridors that reshaped themselves based on the fears of intruders, they discovered that the massive vessel was not just a weapon, it was also a lifeboat. The fortress contained the remnants of the Vorthak's original civilization, before they had become the nightmare entities that terrorized other realities. They had once been a peaceful species, much like the council races before something had driven them to become monsters. Commander Bae Hyojin found the central core of the fortress, where the Devourer Prime waited in a chamber built from crystallized despair. The entity that had terrorized multiple realities was revealed to be the last survivor of the original Vorthak leadership, driven insane by eons of hiding from whatever had destroyed their homeworld. The battle for the fortress core was fought not with weapons, but with words as human negotiators worked to break through the madness and reach whatever remained of the creature's original personality. Dr. Park Min-ji used her expertise in xenopsychology to communicate with an entity that had forgotten how to think in anything but terms of fear and hunger. What the humans discovered was that the Vorthak had been running for so long that they had forgotten what they were running from. They had become so focused on survival through causing terror that they had lost sight of their original goal, which had been to find a reality where they could be safe from their pursuers. The Devourer Prime finally broke down and revealed the truth about what had driven them to become monsters. The entity described something that existed in the deep spaces between realities, something that hunted civilizations across multiple dimensions and fed on entire species. The Vorthak had fled from this ultimate predator and had become predators themselves in a desperate attempt to grow strong enough to eventually fight back Admiral Song. Jiho coordinated the evacuation of Vorthak survivors as human forces worked to shut down the dimensional rifts that connected the two realities. Many of the enemy creatures were too far gone to be saved, but some could still remember what they had been before fear and despair had twisted them into monsters. The war ended not with conquest, but with something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans offered sanctuary to their former enemies, providing them with worlds where they could try to rebuild their civilization without needing to feed on the suffering of others. It was an act of mercy that confused both the Vorthak survivors and the Council species, who had expected humanity to simply exterminate their enemies. But the victory came with a terrible cost. The dimensional rifts had served as a beacon that announced the presence of advanced civilizations to whatever was hunting between realities. The entity that had driven the Vorthak to madness now knew that this galaxy existed, and it was already beginning to move toward them. Director Yu Minho of Human Intelligence quietly began preparing for a war that would make the Vorthak invasion look like a minor skirmish. The reports from Vorthak survivors described an enemy that consumed entire realities and grew stronger from each civilization. It destroyed. It was something that made the Council's worst nightmares seem pleasant by comparison, as the galaxy celebrated humanity's victory over the dimensional invaders. Human military planners worked on defensive strategies for an enemy that might arrive next year or next century. There was no way to know when the real threat would arrive, but there was no doubt that it was coming. The Council species began to understand that their peaceful galaxy had been noticed by forces that were far more dangerous than anything they had ever imagined. The humans had saved them from the Vorthak, but in doing so, they had also revealed their existence to predators that hunted. Across multiple realities, Earth's government made a decision that would have seemed impossible 50 years earlier. They began sharing human military technology with the other Council species and offering training in warfare tactics that had been considered too violent for civilized beings. The galaxy was going to need every advantage it could get. Ambassador Yoon So-young stood in the Council Assembly Hall and listened to reports about humanity's victory over an enemy that should have been impossible to defeat. The other species praised human courage and ingenuity, but she could see the fear in their eyes. They had realized that their newest allies were capable of things that made them very dangerous. Friends. General Wu Jin addressed the Council with news that would change everything about how the galaxy approached defense. The dimensional war had been won, but the victory had also served as a signal to things that were much worse than the Vorthak. The real enemy was still out there, and it was already moving toward them. The humans had spent 50 years learning to be peaceful explorers and diplomats, but they had never stopped being human. When the galaxy needed defenders, they had remembered what they were capable of, when properly motivated. Now they were preparing for a war that would determine whether any life in their reality would survive, as human fleets took up defensive positions around Council worlds and human engineers began building weapons that violated every treaty about acceptable military technology. The galaxy realized something important. Humanity had not just saved them from the Vorthak invasion, they had revealed themselves to be the kind of allies you wanted when the universe decided to try to kill you. The peaceful galaxy that the Council had built was over, but something new was beginning. A reality where civilized species could survive because they had learned to be friends with the monsters that lived in the same neighborhood. The humans had shown that even the most peaceful civilization needed to remember how to fight when the alternative was extinction. And somewhere in the dark between realities, something ancient and hungry had noticed the signal created by the dimensional war and was beginning to move toward a galaxy that had just learned it was not alone in the universe.